And to you, JC.
Well, thank you, Kendra, and thank you everyone for joining us in today's webinar. We're very lucky to be joined by Orshi Desi, the Executive Director at Organic Materials Review Institute. We're going to be learning more about OMRI here in a minute. You know, I'm, as Kendra indicated, also part of the Florida Organic Growers team, along with Kendra and Emily, and we encourage anyone who's listening and participating in this webinar today to contact us if you have any questions about organic practices. We'll talk here in just 1 minute about our transition to organic partnership program. That's a program that many of you probably have heard of, but one that we want to remind you of, and hoping that you can use when it comes to all of the various resources and information that we can provide with you. Today, we're going to be talking about something that we regularly get questions about, which is inputs, and how farmers can use inputs, or even, you know, homeowners, and if you want to be or interested in growing organic crops and organic vegetables, inputs is something that I'm sure you're going to be curious about. So Orji is going to talk to us about, you know, the role that OMRI has as it relates to that, and then just a lot of very, hopefully, useful information to all of you. But before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that this webinar is supported through the United States Department of Agriculture and their Transition to Organic Partnership Program, TOPP. TOPP is a program of the USDA Organic Transition Initiative, and it is administered by the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service and the National Organic Program. FOG is the lead center in the Southeast region, and we are currently in our second year of a 5-year project. As part of that project, we will be focusing in 5 key programmatic areas that include farmer-to-farmer mentorship, community building, technical assistance and training, data collection, and workforce training and development. All of these areas are available to any farmer in the Southeast region, and for free. This is something that all you have to do is contact FOG if you want to find out more about how to be either a mentor if you're a farmer with experience running or working in an organic farm, or if you want to be a mentee and you want to be mentored by a farmer, for instance. Community building is something that we're hoping we're going to be and continue to do throughout the project. We have close to 30 partners in the Southeast that covers 7 states, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, of course, Florida, and 2 territories, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So you can imagine that with, you know, all of those states, multiple organizations, and you know, farmers and people being part of it, we're building community, and we're really proud and hopeful that we'll continue to, you know, strengthen those relationships with, you know, people that are just passionate about organic. Technical assistance and training is something that we will continue to do. So once again, you can visit our website, which you can see here on this slide. If you have specific questions about organic practices or just want to learn more about, we're here to provide, you know, that assistance to you. We're also having and developing trainings throughout our state here in Florida, but also the Southeast region. But all of that information can be found on our website. So I encourage everybody to visit our website and find out more about some of the work that we're doing. Here's just a you know, slide with a picture of the entire country and the various regions. There are 6 regions that are part of the Organic Transition Initiative. And as I mentioned, Florida and Florida Organic Growers is the lead center in the Southeast region. So you can see some of the partners that are part of our region. And once again, encourage everybody listening and participating in this webinar to find more by visiting our website. With that, I am going to turn it over to Orshi, who is going to get us started on learning more about allowed inputs and how OMRI, the Organic Materials Review Institute, once again, can help to make sure that you are using allowed inputs in your farm or your garden.
Thanks so much for the welcome. We can go to the next slide because I believe you're the one that has control here. So who or what is OMRI? Not sure how familiar many of you are with us. So OMRI is a 501c3. We're a nonprofit organization. And what we're most known for is reviewing input materials, things like fertilizers, feed additives, processing aids, to determine whether they meet organic standards for inputs. We currently do that for both the National Organic Program and also the Canadian Organic Regime. We are mission driven, so everything that we do at OMRI is underpinned by our commitment to the global organic community, these reviews that we provide, and of course, a lot of education and technical assistance to our stakeholders, so certifiers, different government organizations that we reach out to and work with. So if we take it to the next slide, I often like to talk about what OMRI is not. It seems a little counterintuitive, but I like to get these out there right when we start. So is an OMRI-listed product considered certified? The answer is no. So OMRI is not a USDA organic certification. It is just a verification of organic inputs, or inputs that go into organic food, I should say. Does the OMRI listing mean that a product is organic? No. Again, that USDA organic seal is for food. It's not for these inputs. If you use a product as a farmer that's OMRI listed, can you use it however you want in organic food production? And so again, the answer here is no. There's definitely limits, and then you work with your certifier to determine what those are. We're often asked if OMRI is a regulatory body. We are not a regulatory body. We are a 501c3. And then because the product is listed with OMRI, does it mean that we've looked at it for any efficacy and claims? And again, the answer is no. We're just looking at it to verify that it meets NOP guidelines as an input for use in organic farming. So if we go to the next slide, then you might think, what exactly do you guys do at OMRI? You don't do any of those things. So again, it's that independent verification of inputs against those organic regulations. Our certification bodies, or we call them CBs, still review how that input is used in organic food production, right? So we're looking at an input in a vacuum. Your certification body is looking at how that input is used in food production. And certification bodies ultimately have the final say, and OMRI listing just makes that a little bit easier. And we'll talk about that. So let's take it to the next slide. So just taking a step back to understand how some of this communication works. We have at the top the USDA Agricultural Marketing Services, NOP, the National Organic Program. And they have a National Organic Standards Board that advises them. And the USDA and NOP work with various trade partners. So the NOP has an accreditation program for organic certifiers and certification bodies. And so they have oversight directly there. Farmers and ranchers, processors and handlers, they utilize those certification bodies. And then, you have your retailers and consumers that are looking for those USDA organic labels. So where does OMRI fit into this picture? OMRI there is no special material review organization accreditation for any kind of MRO like OMRI. What OMRI does have, we have an ISO certification, a 17065 certification, and we were really founded by certifiers who needed an extra they needed this partner to review these inputs because it can take up a lot of time. So currently OMRI sits a little bit outside of this diagram that I show. We work with the National Organic Standards Program, writing technical reports for them. We collaborate with USDA if there's any questions that come up. So we're really active and involved. We work with the certifiers, providing technical assistance. We provide the OMRI products list that a lot of farmers, processors, handlers, ranchers use. So we sit outside of this really in a big advisory capacity in a lot of ways. So if we go to the next slide, just to break it down a little bit more, this is just something I really like to drive home this point that the inputs that are listed have that OMRI listed seal, and that USDA organic label really goes for the food or the products. So just something that I always OMRI and OMRI listing does not mean that it's USDA organic. The NOP does not provide that type of a seal. So if we go on to the next slide, I want you to imagine that you're a farmer and you're going to use this potting soil. And multiple farmers are using this potting soil, and you're this potting soil manufacturer, and you don't have any type of a listing, but you're providing to someone who's trying to get certified organic. What ends up happening is the farmer in their organic system plan puts down the soil, and let's say they're certified by Oregon Tilth or OTCO. Then Oregon Tilth has to go back and work with this potting soil manufacturer to get all of the information, their formulation, their manufacturing processes, what's added, all of these things in order to approve it for a specific farmer. So then another farmer goes to use that same potting soil, and let's say they're getting certified by CCOF. CCOF, again, has to go back to that potting soil manufacturer and repeat that entire process. So does that mean what it means is that there's some flexibility that if an input is not OMRI listed, that your certifier can review that input. However, they always have to go back to get a lot of additional information. So it's a lot of repetitive work, and it's a lot of busy work, especially for that potting soil manufacturer, if you think of it. So if we go to the next slide, what really demonstrates the ease of having something that is OMRI listed is OMRI collects that information from the potting soil manufacturer once, right? And so if someone, then a farmer or a handler or processor comes in and they're purchasing that OMRI listed product, they already know that it has been looked at for the regulation against organic or against the organic regulations, and that there's not really further evaluation work that they have to do. That certifier can contact OMRI for additional information on that listed input, but they don't have to continually go back to the potting soil manufacturer, and that potting soil manufacturer doesn't continually have to provide that information. So a couple of things here. It really shrinks the the organic certification time for that final product, because you're not having to collect that information. And I definitely think it reduces a lot of repetitive frustrations that come up to have a single point that you can go to for that information. So if we go to the next slide, just wanted to give you an overview, super high level. The OMRI listing isn't a rubber stamp. We definitely dig in really deep. We take a look at formulations, manufacturing processes, the product labels. We look at any excluded methods, lab analysis, a lot of other additional information. There's a technical review of that against the appropriate regulation. There's an internal decision panel that reviews a decision on whether or not something should be listed. But we also have an external advisor. We have an external advisory council, and we have external review panels that are made up by certifiers and people in the industry. So if we have questions about an input or we're unclear about what we should do, we have industry backing that we can take that to that can provide feedback for us as well. And then a product becomes listed and gets a certificate. It's either allowed, it's allowed with restrictions, or it's something that becomes prohibited. And then it's not just a one and done. There's an ongoing compliance factor to it, where we're continually following back up with that input manufacturer, taking a look at any product changes that are made. There's some limited re-reviews that we might do of that formulation. Sometimes we inspect a certain number of facilities. And of course, whenever you put your seal out there on a product, people will complain and bring forth things that aren't OMRI, or bring forth things that they're accusing maybe a product that's OMRI listed of containing that we don't have. So we have an investigations team that does ongoing investigations on anything of that nature that we get in. So definitely a really robust process behind that OMRI listed product. And what's really great about this is when a certifier has questions about any inputs that are listed, it's something that we can work with them on and answer questions. So if we go to the next slide, our list is pretty extensive. We just hit over 10,000 products in 2023. I would say the majority of our products that we have are listed in crops. So we have crops, um, livestock, and processing aids. So crops is probably about 80% of these listings. So things that you might use within crops. But this list is completely free, and very, very customizable. If we go to the next slide, I know you guys are going to get a copy of this presentation. So I included a lot of links here to help get you to the appropriate search terms, and different resources that we have on our website. So we've got our online search tool. Again, that's what's probably the most beneficial to people looking at what type of inputs that they need to be using. If you really want to, I like to say, nerd out or geek out about inputs and really understand a lot of the technical components of it, the Organic Integrity Learning Center does have a course about inputs as well that you can take. Um, and then, feel free to follow us on any of the socials. We often do little mini trainings or micro trainings and really try to get out there to answer questions for you.
Thank you, Orzi.
Thank you.
So I think now that we hopefully have a little better understanding of what OMRI is, we would like to maybe talk a little bit about what the role of the certifiers in approving those inputs for the farmers that are either seeking organic certification, because you have to remember that if you are a farmer who is interested in becoming certified organic, you're going to need to contact a certifier, and the Organic Integrity Database, which is part of the USDA National Organic Program, is where you can go and find, certifiers in your area. And you don't have to necessarily use the certifier that is in your state, in your particular state. You can shop around, you can call them, you can try to find out more about the certifier, how it is that they work. But all certifiers will be requesting that you complete what's called an organic system plan or an organic farm plan, organic corridor plan. They have sometimes different, terms for it, but it's an organic plan. And that organic plan has questions specific to the organic regulations. And one of the things that it always asks is to provide information about the inputs that you plan to use. So the certifiers will review and approve, inputs before they can be used in the organic farm. Now, because what Orji was explaining, it's easier when those inputs that the farmer wants to use are OMRI approved, or OMRI have the OMRI seal on it. What happens when they don't? Well, this is where the certifier will, again, Orji was explaining, will have to review those inputs, and they are the ones, the certifier will have to directly, if it's not OMRI approved, they'll have to contact the company or the manufacturer of the input directly to make sure that they're compliant with the organic regulations. So basically, in that manner, we're ensuring that the input, when they're not OMRI approved, still comply with the national organic standards. So the certifier basically is reviewing and approving those inputs. One thing that's something note, mentioning is that if you contact a particular certifier and that input that you want to use is not an OMRI approved input, and they review it, once they review that input and it goes into their database and list of approved inputs that the certifier keeps, other farmers that come and want to use that same input, they don't have to repeat that process. But that is only for that particular certifier. I hope this makes sense, for that certifier and farmers who are using that certifier. This is not a list that the certifier will make public. because the certifiers are not in the business of promoting or advising or recommending particular inputs. They are doing this solely for those farmers that are using their service to certify their farm. Okay, I hope that makes sense. But obviously, if you have questions, please feel free to put it in the chat so we can expand on that specifically. So, just to summarize, how does the input approval process work? The certifier will then gather the information. What's important here is that the farmer has to provide an exact name, brand name of that particular input, if such information exists, because it may be something where they might be buying compost, but they're buying compost not necessarily from a specific company, for example, but maybe from a farmer who is interested in selling their compost to farmers. And so the information is gathered. The input then is reviewed by the materials review team. Certifiers also often will have people who are knowledgeable and can review inputs. And then the certifier will either approve or deny that input. Sometimes what happens, why would it be denied? Well, they contacted the manufacturer and they asked for questions that the manufacturer didn't provide, or just they never responded and it took forever to really get that information. So the input may be denied because, once again, the farmer needs to use that input. We don't want to delay the process because we can't really get that information. Similar to the way OMRI does it, the certifier has to review those inputs that they're approving on a regular basis. And they also update that organic input list for their clients or for the farmers that they certify. What's important here as part of that updating is that farmers understand that once they have a list of inputs that they have submitted to the certifier and that have been approved, if there's any changes that they would like to make, either they're indicating that they're no longer going to use a particular input or that they want to add a new input to their list, they will need to contact their certifier to request or to inform them of either A, I want to add a new input to my list, or B, I'm not going to be using that input anymore, so you can take it off my list. In either case, please remember to inform your certifier, especially when you're wanting to add an input. It's very hard to realize that you used an input that you thought was allowed and didn't notify the certifier, and later find out that that particular material, that particular input contains something that is prohibited. Once you apply it and you did not notify the certifier, and it is found that it is not compliant with the regulation, then that can be, quite a, problem, because it may mean that the input, one, well, you have to stop using it, and two, if it was applied to your soil, field, or whatever, that would have to be, that would lose its certification. Maybe it won't lose the entire certification of the farm, depending on where it was applied, but certainly the area and locations of where it was applied will mean that the certifier will have to, decertify, if you will, that particular field or area where it was applied. So always notify your certifier before you use an input if you want to add new inputs to your list. Important is to always keep records of all of your improved inputs, meaning where they're applied, when they were applied, and how they're being used. So what happens, and I just mentioned or alluded to the fact that if you use a prohibited substance, or it is found that your input was indeed prohibited, or it contained a prohibited ingredient, then the certifier will have to issue adverse actions. That may mean that they will issue a non-compliance. If it is something that can be corrected, then obviously, they will notify you on that notice. If it's not, once again, as I mentioned, the field or location of where that prohibited substance was applied will be suspended. It might mean that it will be, suspended for 3 years. That new location will go into a 3-year transition. So I can't emphasize enough. Always check with Certifier before adding or applying new inputs that are not on your list of approved inputs. I think Oshi also mentioned one of the things that can happen with many inputs is that those inputs, although allowed, have restrictions. So please make sure that when you're using inputs or allowed materials that have restrictions, that you follow the input restrictions. It's very, very important. Read the product label and make sure that you're using the rates and any information or instructions on how that input needs to be used. And just like in the previous slide, and anytime, always keep detailed records of all input applications, including those that are obviously approved. Organic farming, one of the things that we often want to remind people is that organic farming is not about replacing allowed inputs or replacing prohibited inputs with allowed inputs. It is more than that. It is not an input replacement approach. It's a holistic approach. It's a systems-based way of farming. So please keep in mind, because there's a lot of things that practices that may not require necessarily the use of inputs, but that are part of that organic system plan that you have to consider to enhance soil health and the biodiversity in your farm. Always focus on the long-term sustainability, then rather than just replacing again those prohibited inputs or substances and thinking that you're just trying to fix a problem. Always maybe think about it in the long term, which I think it's very important when we use organic practices. Another thing that it's I think important for us to note is that similar to OMRI, certifiers cannot give you advice or recommendations or provide any type of consultation. The certifier's role is to make sure that farmers are complying with the regulations and that they're following the organic regulations. They cannot give you any advice or recommend what inputs might work for a particular problem. However, Florida organic growers, through our Southeast Transition to Organic Partnership Program, can provide technical assistance and information that may help you overcome some of the challenges that you may encounter as an organic farmer. So please contact FOG or some of our partner organizations throughout the Southeast if you have specific questions about organic practices, because we're here to help. So what are some of the key takeaways, from today? One is that all inputs must be approved by the certifier prior to use. And as I was mentioning just a minute ago, always check with your certifier before you use any input. Even if it's the first time that you're going through a certification process or you've been certified for many years, if you want to add inputs, please contact the certifier before you use them. It's very, very important. And then just keep them informed of any updates or changes to that input list. I just mentioned that, organic farming is more than input replacement. It is a holistic approach. So we're really thankful for having OMRI talk to us today about their role, but they also know and constantly remind, folks that just because an OMRI or a product is OMRI approved, one doesn't mean, because we're not here to say this is a really good input or talk about efficacy. We know that it is compliant with the regulations, and you can be sure that there's not going to be any problems with OMRI approved products. But always check with your certifier once again, and make sure that you keep them informed about all the use of all of your inputs. Using an improved input, unfortunately, will likely mean that you farm or location of where it was applied will be suspended for 3 years. And finally, certifiers are responsible for reviewing and approving inputs. Every year, certifiers review your organic plan or updates to organic plans every year, and they also inspect the farm every year. So that is part of how we're ensuring that all of us involved in the organic industry are maintaining the integrity of the organic label, and consumers can also, be a piece of that what they're buying is indeed organic according to the label. All right. With that, we want to thank everybody once again for joining our webinar, and of course, we want to thank OMRI and ORGI for joining us today. We encourage you to visit our website if you have or are interested in some of the work that we're doing through the Southeast Transition to Organic Partnership Program. But with that, I'm wondering if there's any questions, Kendra, because we're happy to try to answer any questions that you all might have about today's webinar.
Yes, thank you, JC. Thank you, Orji, again. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So we are going to be opening up for questions. I do see that there are 2 questions in the chat right now. One, and this is clarification, and JC, I know that you just kind of reiterated that it is important to notify your certifier, get that approval before a new input is added to your organic systems plan. But the question is it required to pre-notify the certifier, or is this just a best practice?
It is required. That's a pretty straightforward, I hope, and simple answer is. And again, I can tell you personally, I've worked for a certification agency and can say that we, and in my experience, had to suspend farms when they apply something and they, were acting in faith. They went down to the, local feed and, farm store, and they said, oh yeah, this is organic. It actually says it right there on that label. But as Orji told us, just because the word organic is on that input, it doesn't mean that one is allowed or that it is certified organic, because inputs are not certified organic. So they trusted the person who also might have thought that this was indeed organic, but it contained a prohibited substance. So guess what happens? If you apply it, and we later find out that that input contained a prohibited ingredient, prohibited substance, then, as I was saying a couple of slides ago, that location is going to be particular acreage area is going to be suspended for 3 years. So yes, it's a requirement because we don't want this to be suspending part of a farm, especially if it was the entire farm. Then that entire farm is going to lose its certification, and the transition period is going to be 3 years.
Great, thank you. There was also a question about inputs. If either Orji or Juan Carlos, if either of you had any thoughts or could provide information on, how you decide the inputs that are used on farm, what are some of the limitations that farmers need to consider, or just really any other considerations that might be helpful to share with our attendees.
So I'll let Orji also add to what I think is ways that farmers or just anyone in general who is growing crops, or even if it's something that you're growing in your backyard, need to consider. And planning, this is where the planning piece of it is important. So, and typically the organic system plan, organic farm plan divides this into categories. So you know that you're gonna need to deal with soil management. So soil is important, and in fact, soil health is the key to organic farming. So think about what your soil needs, because soil is a living organism, and start thinking about what are the types of materials that you're going to need to maintain that soil. If it's going to be compost, or if it's going to be, you're not feeding plants necessarily, you're feeding the soil. So that's one thing. So inputs, materials that are required for your soil are going to be things that you need to consider. Pests, weeds, disease, you're always going to have them, especially in places like Florida. We know, those of us who live in Florida, how hot and warm and humid it can be. So there's always going to be pests, there's always going to be weeds, and there's also going to be disease. Same thing and same approach. Now, in the case of pests, weeds, and diseases, there's a lot of things that you're going to have to do prior to using, even if it's an allowed input, preventive practices, crop rotations, and other things that don't necessarily require the use of inputs that organic farmers, organic gardeners typically do before they can use that input. But same thing, you want to maybe start looking for things that you might be able to use as it relates to the management of those pests, weeds, and diseases. OMRI, which you can talk about this on their website. You can just go to their website and then just search for even just generic words when it comes to these topics, and they will provide that the website will provide you with a list of all of the inputs that are OMRI approved that they review for particular. Now, I don't think it's specific to if you have problems with aphids that you're going to be able to find that particular input necessarily, but there you can get a lot of information through that as well. So those are just some, in my opinion, some of the things that you might be able to do as you plan. And this being the key word, in my opinion, is plan. County extension offices are also another source for information as it relates to practices and things that you can do as an organic farmer. But it's really, in my opinion, such a great thing to think about, that the process all begins with having that organic plan. And the organic plan that the certifier sends to you all actually can serve as a guide, because those questions are very specific to practices. It gets the farmer thinking about some of these things, especially if they've never actually put a plan together. I think in so many ways, the organic system plan can answer some of those questions or concerns. Jorge, I don't know if you wanted to maybe just, give us a little bit of your wisdom and knowledge as it relates to that.
Yeah, let me jump in here. I think what I want to really emphasize here is that one of the things that is really what you're essentially saying, and I think is also really important, is that communication piece with the certification body, both for the farmer, and then if that input is OMRI listed, with OMRI if there's questions. Now, I do know that some farms, for example, they might make their own input on farm, compost, et cetera. And if the question is that acceptable? Can we do that? That might not be a great candidate for an OMRI listing. You're only doing it to utilize it on farm, not for a greater sales effort. And again, I think what's the important piece there is that communication with the certification body and whether or not it is allowable, how it's there. I will say that one of the resources I would recommend for OMRI, if a farmer is making their own inputs, typically, again, compost is the big one that we see, is we have a generic materials list, as you alluded to, JC. And so essentially that generic materials list lists all of the materials that can be used in inputs and the regulations that and which regulations that they meet. So that could be a good starting point. But again, utilizing that list as you're potentially making that input or putting that input together, but then that communication piece with the certifier so that whatever end product you're using in your soil or with your crops is allowed and approved by them.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you mentioned compost, because you're absolutely right. That's one of the things that typically farmers, and in fact, we would encourage farmers to maybe, if at all possible, to start making their own compost if they think that that's something that can benefit them. But compost is one of those other things and topics that just because you put all your scraps, food waste into a pile, and also added chicken litter or horse manure or added manure, and then just left it there for a long time, and it's maybe months or years, and it's just been sitting there, and the pile has been just fully, and I quote unquote, composted, aged. It's that under the regulation, unless you kept track of temperatures and turning it, that wouldn't be considered compost under the organic regulations. And more importantly, that means that if it's not compost, which there's no restriction in the timing of application, but guess what? Manure does have a restriction. So you would have to be very careful. And once again, this is an example of something that you might want to check with your certifier to make sure that you understand.
Right. And I guess in a similar vein to that question, there was another question that came in just regarding those resources. So we know that we can visit the OMRI website to get information. Are there other resources that either of you would recommend that FOG provides, or even outside of FOG, where farmers who want to use those inputs that are okay for their organic farms, other websites, resources, groups on Facebook, other resources that you might recommend farmers can go to find referrals on inputs they can use?
Well, I certainly think that, especially for us here in the Southeast and some of the partners that we're working with, Rodale Institute is one that comes to mind. They do have information, not always specifically to just inputs, but many things that perhaps can be of use to organic farmers. The topic of inputs is one where, if honestly, if there's not enough research being done on the efficacy of the inputs, then that's maybe part of that, I guess, question and concerns that some farmers might have. But ATRA, the what is it? Attainable Technology Transfer for Rural Areas. I think that's what that acronym stands for, which is part of NCAT, another partner, in our program, does have a lot of really good fact sheets and resources that relates not only to transitioning to organic or organic practices, but I think also inputs. But if the question is, well, again, who can we go to, or what resources can we find about input specifically? I think part of my hesitation would be to say, yeah, these inputs are allowed, and perhaps even how you can use inputs in a smart manner. But if the question is also about efficacy, I think you can always try to contact your county extension offices. In some areas, in some places, they might not always have the experience dealing with these types of questions. But FOG, once again, we're here to try to assist you in with those questions. And if we don't have the answers, you can be sure that we will try to find the answers to you, because we do have, ways of contacting the experts or maybe trying to provide at least some guidance to some of the questions that you might have.
I want to just follow up on that because one of the things that I think is so powerful about the TOPP initiative and with the various regional leads is really that mentorship piece and connecting transitioning farmers to with farmers that are already certified organic. So really utilizing that piece of it too, if you're looking for a thought partner or someone to bounce things off of, I think that's also really valuable. And then just underpinning that earlier in the presentation, I did provide the resource guide that we have at OMRI. So there's definitely social media avenues on there where sometimes we do have farmers jump on and ask questions. And we're not really, we're there to, what we talk about is what is OMRI listed. That's all we can talk about, not what works, in Florida. Does that work in the state of Washington? That's really where I think the TOPP program is so powerful with their regions, is that you can really leverage those relationships through that.
Yeah. And I'm so glad, Orji, that you mentioned, because you're absolutely right. Farmers, the farmer mentors, typically are the ones who have used those inputs many times. And so if you want to get an straight answer for somebody who's actually used it, the farmers are the ones that organic farmers are the ones that I think we can, sort of, tap into finding out if some of those inputs actually do work or what it is that they've used in the past to, try to solve some of the problems.
Great. Well, we did have a few other questions in the queue. So this question, Orji, maybe I will ask you to answer first. What are some of the most common reasons that a product would be denied for OMRI certification? This question came in ahead of time.
That's a great question. So I think one of the big things to consider is what something is made out of, right? So the first real step of what we're doing is a formulary review. And so in general, if substance is synthetic, it's going to be prohibited. It's just something that to keep in mind. So we definitely follow the national list. That's what we base our reviews on. But synthetic substances prohibited generally for organic crop production.
And I actually can maybe provide an example, and OJ, correct me if I'm wrong, but for instance, common input that you might want to use if you're growing, your own seedlings, for example, and then you go to the store and buy a soil mix or a substrate where you're going to be germinating those seeds, and you buy and bring this, substrate, media, soil mix. It's got peat in it. It's got a little bit of perlite. And then you don't realize, look, everything looks good. It's pretty natural. You don't realize that it has a wetting agent. Orji was mentioning synthetics. Wetting agents are actually sometimes, not that uncommon in soil mixes, but often prohibited. So you wouldn't be able to use those seedlings. Those seedlings wouldn't be compliant because they came into contact with a synthetic substance. So there's, and obviously, there's many reasons why an input may not be allowed, but typically it's because it does contain something that is prohibited. So.
Right. And then just related to that, there was a question about foraged materials, products that are, we have wild caught fish, pasture clippings, municipal compost, shredded tree debris as some examples, or other products that maybe, like we talked about compost earlier. How can farmers, address those in using those as inputs?
Go ahead, Orji.
So I will just say, it's interesting that the municipal compost is one of the things that came out. We actually do have municipal compost facilities that provide OMRI listed compost. So that's definitely possible, and something that does happen. And so I just wanted to put that out there that a lot of these materials that are listed, I think in essence could be okay, but then the question of what is it mixed with? What are we putting that with? Is it just this one thing? What are all of those other ingredients that are going into it? So it's not just looking at this one very narrow substance, it's looking at the whole formulation, which I think is really important.
Yeah. And I think to add to that, because you were mentioning some of the particular maybe ingredients or the things, materials that will go into that compost, they don't have to be from an organic source. I get that question a lot. Does the manure need to come from organic, chickens, for example, or hens, layers, or the manure, horse or cow, does it have to come from an organic farm if you're adding animal manure to your compost? The answer to that is no. That's not a requirement. Now, the one thing that cannot be used are biosolids. Biosolids, sewage sludge, human waste cannot be part of compost and composting in organic farms. So, but yeah, that's a good question. Just
Thank you. Well, I think we have time for one last question. And this is more generalized for farmers that are just starting out. So this is kind of a two-part question. Do you need a certifier to test the soil, to test the ground? And can you use any vacant, untouched land to start organic gardening, producing, farming?
so yeah, you can use any land that you can show. If you want to certify the farm, you can show that the location has been free of prohibited substances for at least 3 years. If you buy the property and you own the property for more than 3 years, then you as the farmer would be the one who is attesting that for the last 3 years, you have not used any prohibited substances. And typically, that is part of the certification process. There is a form or document in the organic plan called the land use affirmation. And so that basically says, which has to be signed, that you have not used anything in the last 3 years. Now, if it's been less than 3 years and you purchased it from an owner who told you that they also have not applied anything in the last year or 2 years or however long that is, then but you've only owned it, for 2 years or less than three, most certifiers, if not all certifiers, are going to require also, a signature from the previous owner, so that 3 years you can account for those 3 years, and that property is eligible for certification immediately. Now, if you can show that it's been 3 years, then yes, you would have to go through that transition period of whatever length the last application or ownership of the farm or location you've had.
Thank you, JC. Well, thank you both so much. I know we are just at time here, so I did want to leave a minute, JC or G, if you had any final thoughts before we go today.
I think I just want to again underpin a big thing that we keep coming back to, which is communication and keeping certifiers in the know, keeping people that are listing products in the know about changes or what you're planning to use. This is not an ask for forgiveness situation when we're looking at organic certification. It's definitely an ask for permission. And so that open line of communication is so essential across all the parties.
Yeah. Because I didn't actually answer the entire question, the previous question. I just want to say that the certifiers don't require the soil tests. It's not a requirement. You don't have to show or run very expensive tests about, what might remain in that soil as it pertains to prohibited substances. Just to clarify that, it's I think something to maybe keep in mind. It's not a requirement. Obviously, soil testing is a really useful tool for all farmers because you have to know what's in your soil. And then just to reemphasize, as Orja was saying, communication. You contact the certifier. If you have questions, the certifier can certainly provide guidance in terms of what's allowed, what's prohibited, what does the regulations say about this. May even be able to tell you what, as it pertains to records, what may be sufficient or not adequate, what types of records. They don't provide consultation service or give you recommendations once again, but they are there to answer your questions as it relates to complying with the regulations. So that's very, very important. And us here at Florida Organic Growers are happy to always talk to you and answer specific questions. And as I indicated, if we don't know the answer to a specific questions, we have ways of talking to the experts and at least trying to help you find the answers to those questions. So don't be shy. Don't hesitate to contact us. About any and all questions as it relates to organic farming practices and the organic regulations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Juan Carlos, Orji. We are so appreciative for your time, your expertise. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today for this webinar. We hope it was informative. And if you have any questions, as JC mentioned, please feel free to reach us at setop@foginfo.org. If we didn't get around to your question, we will be following up through email to send you an answer. We hope you can join us at some of our upcoming events. We have the website on the screen, organictransition.org. We are in the Southeast region, so there are a bunch of events up on our events page. We hope you can join us. And again, we'll be following up with a link to this recording soon after we end. So thank you all again for your time and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.